Too bad for them. This is Sarah Grimm from the Wisconsin Historical Society, and I want to welcome you here today to our webinar about ingesting and preserving records from agencies, departments, and systems. This is the second of our hot topic webinars and part of our ongoing CoSA and Preservica Practical Digital Preservation webinar series that started this fall and is going to continue through mid-next year. And as you can see on this slide, we're going to pick it up again next February. This is the last one of the year. So our next hot topic webinar is going to be about automating email archiving and preservation. That's going to be in February. And in March, we're going to have our next online workshops, parts 1 and 2 again, which will be a repeat of the first one, the one that happened in November. We're doing those 3 times. But if you would like to see it again, please feel free to sign up for either one of those or any of the ones remaining. You can just go out to the link at the bottom of this slide. And we will be sending out reminders too, just prior to those starting. For today's program, we're going to welcome Michael Hope, who's been guiding us through this little adventure of ours. And while he has worked in IT and information management for over 25 years, his recent focus as marketing director for Preservica has been to raise the awareness of the importance of digital preservation, including devising and running educational programs and partnerships with groups such as CoSA. And we're also very pleased to be joined by Karen Wojcik, who is the Government Records Archivist for the state of Michigan. Karen has worked for the state of Michigan since 1996 and is responsible for appraising public records for their historical value, developing retention and disposal schedules for public records, training government employees about best practices for records management, and for developing electronic records management and preservation strategies. And she has also written and taught the SA-DOS course on the appraisal of electronic records. So she will be sharing her experience with working with state agencies and the transfer of their records to her care. If while we're going through the presentation today, you have any questions, go ahead and just enter them in the chat, and we'll get them at the end. We're leaving plenty of time at the end for questions. And I think that's it. Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. It's also a real delight and privilege to be partnering with CoSA to deliver this series of webinars and workshops, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Can you everybody hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, I just can't seem to get nothing comes through on my hands. I'm also delighted that Karen has joined us today as well, and she's going to be sharing how Michigan are working with their agencies to appraise and accession long-term and permanent records for safekeeping. Karen is going to focus in particular on people and process challenges, and I will then explore how digital preservation systems can help automate the acquisition and ingest of content from other agencies and departments and systems to ensure that those are transferred at the appropriate time, and also finding ways to reduce manual time and effort spent acquiring records for safekeeping. Before I hand over to Karen, I'd just like to explore why digital preservation is beginning to rise up the agenda at many organizations. So many of you will have seen this slide previously, and I think we all know that digital records and content are fragile and susceptible to bit loss and media degradation, but also file format and software obsolescence. So we need some sort of system in place to help us move those file formats to more readable formats in the future. And digital content is becoming an increasing challenge. When we were talking about this a few years ago, a lot of content was digitized content. I think predominantly now most content is becoming born digital, which has its own particular challenges, and it's increasing in diversity and volume on a sort of daily basis, with multiple different types of formats being presented for archive. also, there's a general consensus building that because of faster technology, refresh rates, that content that is already 10 years old or needs to be retained for more than 10 years is also at risk because, as I said, because of faster technology, refresh rates, IT systems being refreshed, and also, in general, longer retention times being applied to records. So that means that digital preservation is no longer just about permanent content. It's also about long-term content, which might have to be safeguarded for for legal mandate or for regulation or for legal defense. So it could be records 10 years plus 75 years, but not necessarily forever. And interestingly, this is something we're seeing in particular happening here in the UK, where county archivists are now beginning to provide services to other departments within the county to digitally preserve, in particular, long-term records. So some examples include planning documents, and recently we have a county which is trying to also preserve or support the preservation of child adoption papers, which don't need to be kept forever, but do definitely need to be kept for 75 years. So what's important with long-term and permanent digital records? So preservation obviously is important to ensure that those records are findable, accessible, and readable over the long term. But also increasingly, we're being told by our customers and partners that we also have to ensure that those documents are also be able to show that they are trustworthy. So if they are challenged in 20 or 30 years' time when they have to reproduce that piece of information or that digital record, they can actually demonstrate good provenance, good authenticity, that is defensively dispositioned if it's been got rid of, and that there's been very clear control, access control right down to that individual record level. And the good news is that this also translates into, as we've explored in some of the PDP workshops, that this translates into the requirements of a good digital preservation system as well. So any good digital preservation system will also have audit trails and good metadata management, so you can show provenance and what's happened to the digital record. You can demonstrate authenticity through the use of fixity. Obviously, the core function of preservation through file format migration, but also being able to properly disposition records, have mechanisms for doing that, particularly for long-term records. As I said, good access control, user permissions right down to an individual record level. So those might form requirements above and beyond just doing preservation that you might want to look for if you're looking at digital preservation system. The good news is that there is growing awareness of digital preservation. So if you're involved in an outreach program to your agencies, to your departments, then hopefully the need to look after digital content is the awareness of the need to look after it is increasing. At least we're seeing this within the records management community. There's been a lot of activity through ARMA, particularly at ARMA Live, which happened in Washington, through the Information Management magazine, through various hot topics. So the awareness is growing now, which will hopefully make your lives easier in terms of convincing agencies and departments that they really need to have a good way of looking after their digital records and digital content. If you haven't seen the Preservica guide, Safeguarding Your Vital Long-Term Electronic Records, then that can also potentially form part of your education and your outreach in terms of helping people see the challenge and what the solution might be. So finally, before I hand over to Karen, we looked at this a little bit on the last webinar. Also, the state courts are now beginning to wake up to the need to look after their long-term and their permanent records. And this was a topic at the Court Technology Conference in Minneapolis, which happened back in September. So there were a number of topics looking at how to manage and preserve electronic records. And Preservica has also produced a guide which has been reviewed by the National Center for State Courts, which again helps to explain the challenge. And I think this in particular presents state archives and state courts with the opportunity to to work more closely together, as indeed some of you already are. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Karen, who will talk about how Michigan are tackling this challenge.
Well, hi, and thank you to Michael for inviting me to participate in this webinar today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at the Archives of Michigan when it comes to trying to acquire electronic records and get them into our instance of Preservica, which is the preservation system we acquired in 2012. When we work with state agencies, we work with our records management services on records retention and disposal schedules. The law requires that all records be listed on a retention schedule, that only a schedule can authorize destruction. So it's also the legal document that authorizes the transfer of records to the archives for permanent preservation. And so all of our appraisal decisions are documented there, and it's also what kicks off the need when electronic records are identified. The archives knows we need to start working with that agency to come up with a methodology to ensure routine transfer of the records. Especially with electronic records, we're shortening our transfer timeframes to make sure that we're getting something that's preservable and not something that's already in an obsolete format. Many years ago, you might have heard me talk about a project we did to try to preserve elections records that were already 20 years old, sitting on magnetic tape that had been sitting in a boiler room. Definitely not the ideal conditions for preserving electronic data. And so we years ago understood the need that we needed to be more proactive in getting these electronic records faster from the creators if they were done with the creation phase of the record. The biggest challenges we face, I've listed here, there are 3 of them. The first is getting agencies to remember to transfer their electronic records regularly. We can remind them to a certain extent, but that falls into the second challenge of establishing a reliable contact person. And if that contact person changes and we aren't notified that that person's moved on to a new job or retired, that can be a real problem. Also, there are a lot of electronic records we have appraised, to have archival value that are created in mixed formats, and we may not realize that the agency has transferred from a paper format to an electronic format. And so we may not have started talking electronic records preservation with them as a result because we didn't know the format had changed just yet. A couple of years ago, we were studying the OAIS reference model, and it referred to a supplemental document that I don't think a lot of people have looked at very closely, called the Producer Archive Interface. And it was also published by the same work group. And what it says is that there are 4 phases of the accessioning process for electronic records, or the ingest process. The first is the preliminary phase, which is where you do your appraisal, such as a retention schedule. The second is the formal definition phase, where you actually define what records are going to be transferred, in what frequency they're going to be transferred, what format. The third phase is when you actually conduct the transfer, and then the 4th phase is when you validate that you got the records you expected to get. And as we were reading through it, we decided that it might be a good idea to come up with an electronic records submission agreement to fit into that formal definition phase, something that would supplement, not replace, our records retention schedules that we could use to negotiate with the creator, or in OAIS terms, the producer, to define what we were going to be getting into the archives. And so I've got on the screen for you a screen capture of the document, and we'll get it into the CoSA website, into the Pritz Portal, so other people can use it. And this is the form we've developed to document what we're going to transfer and how, and the frequency and all of that. Full disclosure, we haven't used this form yet. It's something we've developed, but we haven't actually tested it yet. It's something we've just talked about a lot. In fact, we were talking just yesterday, a collection that we've received for years in microfilm format. We're going to start getting the digital images instead, and because it's changing format, and we're going to want to start putting into Preservica, we're going to use this submission agreement to negotiate with the agency how that happens, when that happens. Here's some examples of electronic records that we are receiving on a routine basis. They include education statistics for K-12 schools from our Center for Educational Performance and Information. We get those every year in August. That's kind of their slow time of year. Our Bureau of Elections transfers the precinct results database every 2 years, generally in the January or February following a statewide election. The Michigan House of Representatives and the Michigan Senate are transferring daily session audio recordings to us in July of each year. Originally, the House of Representatives, we had set up an FTP site for them to upload their digital audio into, but because of network security issues, that became a challenge, and so we decided instead to use an external hard drive to get those audio recordings. The other nice thing with both of those agencies is they asked the archives what format we wanted the records in and what things they could do when creating the records to make them more preservable once we got them. So, and also what's nice is that we're getting them practically right away. Within a year of creation, we're getting those digital audio files. So that's working out really well for us. Some of the other things that that we have dealt with is, for many, we've had an electronic records program for a lot of years now, but it wasn't until October 2012 when we got Preservica that we really could tell our creating agencies that we had a solution, that if they transferred records to us, we could do something with them to protect electronic records and keep them accessible over time. So that's why some of our procedures for how we're doing it are still in evolution. We're still testing because up until then we weren't actively trying to acquire records. We're also working with some government agencies on discussion of preservation of long-term, not archival records. For example, our State Court Administrative Office, which coordinates administration of all the courts around the state at the circuit, district, and probate level, they're working on a major initiative to revise the retention schedules that all those courts follow, developing a type of document management system that they all will have the option of using. And we're talking about the permanent preservation of the electronic records that will go into that, or I should say long-term preservation of the electronic records that will go into that document management system. And we're talking to them about using Preservica for that. We're talking about a service model where we would charge them either for the preservation services or preservation and storage services. So it would be a multi-tiered service model that would hopefully generate some revenue to offset some of our preservation costs. So and I think that was all I was planning on talking about. So now I hand this back to Michael, and I can answer questions, I think, at the end. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Karen. And yeah, thank you for sharing that and giving us a little bit of an insight into some of the challenges that you're facing, in particular mainly people and process challenges. What I'd like to focus on now is how digital preservation system and technology can be used to sort of help the process along. Firstly, I think we all know that digital preservation should not be an island unto itself. It needs to be able to connect into other systems, and as Karen was saying, with producers or creators of content, it should make it relatively easy for that content to be ingested. And the idea is that this then frees up your time as state archivist to focus on your archival duties rather than your technology duties, and your outreach programs, and also, most importantly, finding automated ways of ensuring that content gets to you at the right time, rather than, as Karen was saying, relying on people to remember, or the person leaves and you don't necessarily get the information at the right time. So there's, if you're looking at a preservation system, then, as I said, it needs to connect into the wider world, and you should really look for connectors to all sorts of things, so not just to other sort of repositories and content management systems, but also to email, and also you might want to be doing web archiving as well. So the three things, I guess, probably need to look for would be, in particular, connectors for common content management and email systems. Email archiving and preservation is becoming ever more important, particularly for prominent and senior individuals, and that will allow you to automate a lot of content acquisition direct from systems. Also look for easy upload tools, so if people do need to submit content and they're not doing it on a hard drive, but there is a way for them to just very simply drop the content in and have it uploaded to the system, where it can be appraised and further metadata added to it before it goes into the archive. And also, if you're looking at acquiring long-term records, that there's a way to auto classify that information as it gets ingested, so it can be tagged, so that if it does need to be, an action needs to be worked on that record in the future, in 20, 30 years' time, to be appraised, or it needs to be hard deleted at that time, then those policies can be applied to that record, and you can demonstrate back to your agencies and departments that you have that capability. So when we zooming in a little bit on how how you might want to connect to a system, a content management system. This could be within your own organization, or it could be outside of the state archive, and how you might want to automate it. So overall, this is how the content management system and the digital preservation system might sit within the overall information governance and records lifecycle, very much sitting alongside each other, with the digital preservation system focused on long-term and permanent records, and the content management system like SharePoint focused on operational and short-term records. And this is also something that can appeal to the IT communities within agencies or within your own organization, because by acquiring and taking records earlier from content management systems for long-term or permanent retention, it also frees up those operational systems in terms of disk space and also general capacity and performance. So I'm just going to share a quick example of just sort of a few screenshots of how this could be, how the automation could be handled between digital preservation system and, in particular, in this case, a SharePoint system. And we'll also share a link at the end where you can go and see a full demo of this if this is of interest. So here I'm showing a SharePoint library. This is a typical user view of SharePoint, where they've got a number of documents within a library structure. But if I switch to the sort of administrator's view of SharePoint, then a sort of a manual way of getting information out. As a SharePoint administrator, I've got various options for doing backup and restore or doing an export. So it's relatively easy to perform a manual export from a SharePoint library, and which generates a .cmp file, which contains all of the content and metadata. And that can be then sent to a network location, and which can be watched by a digital preservation system, and that whole CMP package can then be automatically ingested, unpacked, and all the files and metadata kept within the preservation system for safekeeping. However, there is a more potentially automated way of working, which can be instigated at the point of creation by the content creator. And this is a key thing, to be able to get as far upstream back to the point of creation as you can, so that for certain documents which are being created, then digital preservation and preservation of that document is being thought of right from the beginning. So within SharePoint, using the standard rules, you can set up within a document library. So here's a rule which you can run: how to manage retention, and you can set a rule that says, in 5 years from the point of creation, I'm going to add an action to that document or that record. And here's just a little example where we've added a plugin to SharePoint. This actually says archive in Preservica, but it could actually be sent to the state archive or whatever action you want to apply in 5 years' time. So at the point of creation, the content creator can apply a retention rule. 5 years after creation, perform this action, and the action is send this document up to for archiving or preservation. And then, like the manual export, that document would be, that record would be dropped into a network folder, which would then be pulled into the digital preservation system for protection. So using both either the manual or the automatic flow would kick off a typical ingest process, which would unpack that CMP file and perform all of the quality checks, like I was saying, fixity checking, virus checking, etc., and ingest those packages into the digital preservation system for safekeeping and separating out the content, but also preserving the hierarchy of that that original SharePoint document library. So that's a very quick example of how having automation can help reach upstream and ensure that documents arrive at the appropriate time into the archive. This was just a few screenshots. I'll also share a link as well to a sort of demo which we recorded in the past if you want to go and look at that. So Just in summary, digital content and records that have already been retained for 10 years or need to be retained for more than 10 years are at risk, as we saw at the beginning. Then we heard from Karen that acquiring and accessioning and appraising information from agencies and other departments is very much about people, process, outreach, and a level of education. If you want to ensure you're getting records on time and at appropriate point, then really try and reach up as far upstream as possible, and digital preservation should really be in the minds of those agencies and should be planned from the outset. And that if you are choosing a digital preservation system, then you look at the wider requirements, not just the fixity and the provenance and the things that I spoke at the beginning, but also ways you can automate the whole process to make sure you get records on time and you don't spend all of your time doing a lot of manual work, and you can free up more of your time then to focus on the outreach and engaging with different agencies. So I said we'd have a couple of practical next steps. So if you want to see the SharePoint, how that works in more detail, then you can go and have a look at that recording of that SharePoint demo. And interestingly, the next webinar in this series, as Sarah was saying, is all about email archiving and preservation, and we'll have some examples there of how we can do that with Outlook and Gmail, which is becoming increasingly important, particularly for prominent individuals' email. Another practical next step is to look at the information which is on the Pritz Portal. And Sarah, did you want to come back in there and talk about Pritz and the next workshops?
Yeah. So yeah, we're going to have our next workshops again in March, on March 8th and the 15th. Those are parts 1 and 2. The link is at the bottom to sign up for those. That's free to everybody. So if you have friends, neighbors, people who might be interested in this topic, go ahead and forward them the link and let them get involved. And then sorry, I had things pop up on my screen. And then the next how-to webinar is the automating email archiving and preservation on February 23rd. That's actually coming up first. But that should be a great opportunity for those of us who are dealing with email and trying to figure out what the heck we're going to do with them. Some of the topics that came up today, part of Series 3.0 coming up here in January is we are going to try to start establishing some affinity groups, people who are interested in the same kind of things to talk about. And I think Karen's presentation today is an excellent example of that. A lot of us are going to be working on that transfer process. What does that look like? Who do we need to talk to? What kinds of things do we need to ask for? And that might be a great topic that we can all kind of get together on and start working out. As Karen pointed out, she hasn't actually used it yet. I think it's a great starting point for many of us. And just bringing in some other ideas from all of you who have started that process or are involved with that process already, and trying to come up with some consistent examples that we can set out there on the Pritz portal for everybody to play off of. But I would like to open it up for questions. I think we're there, aren't we? Or did I just jump ahead, Michael? Sorry.
No, that's perfect.
Okay. Go ahead and ask questions. If you have questions about Karen and her processes, what she's doing, or anything that Michael presented here, go ahead and start typing in the chat box.
Well, I started typing a response to Mark's question, and it doesn't seem to want to send. So I'll just repeat what I wrote and keep going.
Excellent.
We have a small staff, and I actually work in our records management office. I don't work directly for the archives. I work with the archives. So the side effect, you could say it's a benefit or you could say it's not. The side effect of having a very small staff, I'm currently the primary person writing all retention schedules for all government agencies. And so I'm also the one doing the front-end archival appraisal, though Mark Harvey, the state archivist, signs the schedules. As a result, though, I have a lot of contact with the record creators, and so I can easily start those conversations of, okay, we have now appraised this as archival. I know this, and I'm talking to you, the creator. And as a result, let's start talking about how we're going to follow up and get it preserved. Those conversations aren't always as productive as I'd hope. Sometimes people are like, well, you know, they're not ready to talk about it just yet, and so I have to keep track of who I have to follow up with. And sometimes I'm more successful at that than others. I've got a pretty good memory for those things, but definitely not perfect. So hopefully that answers Mark's question.
And then we have a couple of other questions down in the Q&A. When you use the plugin that you mentioned, does it create the workflow for Ingest into Preservica, or does it have to be set up separately?
Okay, thanks for the question. So essentially, the Ingest workflow within Preservica is the pretty standard workflow that you get out of the box. With the product, with the addition of the unpacking step, which unpacks the, in this case for SharePoint, the .cmp file, and then ingests all of those files and looks at every single record as it goes through. The plugin that I mentioned is something that we've created, and we're happy to share that with other organizations and state archives. So it's a plugin which you actually can add to SharePoint, and it's an addition to the standard SharePoint workflow. So I'm showing there the ability to set retention schedules, and then an action, and then that plugin effectively is the action, and what it does then, it will then execute taking that record and dropping it into a watched folder, and then Preservica or the digital preservation system will pick up the information from that watch folder and then do a standard ingest. So if you're interested, then drop me an email and we can tell you more about that plugin, and you can also see it, get a better feel for it as well by having a look at the webinar.
All right, thank you. We've got a few other questions. Mary is asking, how well do automating processes work with records that may have Social Security numbers or other type info?
Good question. It depends where they're actually where they're coming from. I'm not sure what you're. I mean, we can ingest pretty much anything into Preservica. I'm not sure the relevance of the social services.
Mary, are you concerned with being able to isolate and capture the Social Security numbers and the PII type of info during the automating process? If you have everything automated, being able to capture those and know where they are? Let's see. Yeah, and somebody asked if Mary was concerned about redaction. While we're waiting for her to follow up on that, let's see. So you all can type in chat. There's the little chat window up there, or Q&A. It seems, I think chat is kind of going to more all participants, and the Q&A are coming to us, either us individually or at least the presenters. So I had a question where we're waiting for Mary to follow up. Karen, I was just curious, with your process that's going on, when you identify archival materials at the agency level, are they handling them differently? Are they storing them somewhere? Are they tagging them in some way, either, like with a file title or with technology to trigger them to transfer, or is it just kind of a we hope we remember type thing at this point?
It's mostly we hope we try and remember at this point.
Okay.
Our office also administers a document management system that many state agencies are now using, HP Records Manager.
Yeah.
And in that we can identify archival records that are going in, and we can set up a transfer process. The Archives is also a user of HP Records Manager, and we've already done one transfer of electronic records from that. So more records that are in that system, the more we can automate the transfer and not have to worry about the creator remembering and the archives reminding. William Brown also had a question about, do we do workshops to inform agencies about transferring? We offer a lot of training to government agencies about basic records management and more advanced topics. And so transfer of archival records, regardless of format, is addressed in there. I still don't see that as an effective way to make sure the records are routinely transferred. I mean, awareness is step one, right. And you definitely don't want to skip step one, but my experience is you have to be proactive. Transferring things to the archives is not a priority unless the creator really has an appreciation for that value. And you just can't count over time that the person you work with the first time is going to be there the next time that a transfer needs to happen.
Right.
Yeah, so I think Mary's now come back saying, I'm assuming that users could be a larger group of people, so you would need to conceal certain information. So yes, other ways to ultimately flag those types of issues. Yes, you can auto classify information, certain types of records on Ingest, and then you can also apply security settings to those records as well. So the security setting can be very, very tight. You're saying there's larger groups, but you could actually restrict it to only certain users being able to see that information when it's in the archive, not necessarily every user of the system. So yes, you can also classify, and you can set security at time of ingest to restrict who can read that information. There's no auto redaction. I think that was another part of the question at the moment within Preservica. But what some customers do, they have an open copy and a closed original copy, and they will apply have a redacted copy which might get shared to a wider audience.
All right, thank you. And Mary, if that didn't quite answer your question, go ahead and pop another one in. We had a question from Rachel asking if you're developing plugins for other sources besides SharePoint.
The short answer is yes. So we now have a framework which allows us to develop these sort of unpacking and ingest. We call it unpacking and ingest framework, which allows us to connect to other systems. We've certainly got Documentum in the pipeline, and we're going to be pretty much steered by customer and customer needs in terms of other platforms. But yeah, so Documentum's in the pipeline. We started with SharePoint because SharePoint seems to be such a pervasive platform, and a lot of organizations are now beginning to use that as their records management system because Microsoft kind of bundles it in, and the IT guys say times are hard, so go ahead and use SharePoint for your document repository. And so that's where we started there, but we do have plans to add others.
All right, and then Jody, you had a question about the affinity groups, how they might function. So we've been tossing around ideas of how this might work, and I think what we're looking at this point is using this type of format for groups of people who are interested in the same topics, whether it be a policy or procedure, a certain piece of software, whatever it might be, to have the ability to get together online so we don't have to wait for conferences, we don't have to set up a big training session, and being able to manage that so everybody can kind of help each other along the process of getting these things developed. And as people develop, for instance, if we're going to develop that exchange between ourselves and the producers, everybody might be a little bit different on how they do it based on their institution, but we can get together and talk and figure out what the most important pieces of that might be, what it might look like. Occasionally, maybe have an owner of that group, so to speak, and have an online ability to get together and talk and create those documents and then get them out on the Pritz Portal so other people who may not be involved, who are not at that point yet, will have that as a resource going forward. Stay tuned. There will be more information on that next year. All right, any other questions to either Karen or Michael?
Or yourself, Sarah.
Or myself. All right. Karen, do you have any closing thoughts?
Nope, just thanks for inviting me to participate.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. Michael, any closing thoughts? I'm going to take that as a no. All right, everybody. If you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to... Okay. Please feel free to contact any one of us, and we'd be more than happy to get you the answer. But everybody have a great holiday, great New Year, and we look forward to seeing you next year in February.